He's seventh grade. So we've been reading The Secret of Platform 13 by Eva I. Botson. And in this part of the story, they're waiting for the prince to return from the Gump. But in the courtyard of the castle, all sorts of unsavory creatures are starting to come to the castle, and they're so angry. And the last is the harpies. And there were the harpies. They had elbowed their way to the front. These monstrous women with wings and claws of birds, and even the fiercest creatures who waited with them, gave them wide berth. "Tell them to choose a spokesperson, and we will hear what they have to say," said the king. But he knew why they had come and what they had to say, for these creatures of the north were as much his subjects as any ordinary schoolchild or tender-hearted fae. Not only that, sorry, that was my alarm. Not only that, they were useful. They were the police people. There was no prison on the island. There was no need for one. No burglar would burgle twice if it meant a hellhound flying in through his window and taking pieces out of his behind. Any drunken youth going on a rampage soon sobered up after a squint-eyed harridan landed on his chest and squeezed his stomach so as to give him awful dreams. And only you had to say the word harpy to the most evil-minded crook, and he went straight, then and there. And it was a harpy, the chief harpy, who pushed the others aside and came in to stand before the king. She called herself Mrs. Smith, but she wasn't married, and it would have been hard to think of anyone who would have wanted to sit up in bed beside her drinking tea. The harpy's face was that of a bossy lady politician, the kind that comes on the telly to tell you not to eat the things you like and to do something different with your money. Her brassy permed hair was strained back from her forehead and combed into tight curls. Her beady eyes were set on either side of a nose you could have cut cheese with, and her mouth was puckered like a badly sewn buttonhole. A string of pearls was wound around her neck, a handbag dangled from her arm, and she wore a crimpline, stretched top that tucked into a dark green bloomers with frill at the bottom. But from under the bloomers there came long, scaly legs and frightful talons of a bird of prey. And growing out of her back, piercing the crimpline, was a pair of black wings, which gave out a strange, rank smell. "I've come about the prince," said Mrs. Smith in a high, piercing voice. "I'm disgusted by the way this rescue has been handled, appalled, shocked. All of us are. Harpies have been around for hundreds of years. In the old days they were called the Snatchers because they snatched people's food away so they starved to death, or fouled it to make it uneatable. And it wasn't just food they snatched in their dreadful claws. Harpies were used as punishers, carrying people away to dreadful tortures in the underworld." Mrs. Smith patted her hair and opened her handbag. "No," said the king, and put up his hand. "The handbag of harpies are too horrible to describe. Inside is their makeup, face powder, lipstick, scent. But what makeup! Their powder smells like the inside of a slaughterhouse of slaughtered animals, and one drop of their perfume can send a whole army reeling backwards. Not in the palace," he went on sternly. And even Miss Smith obeyed the king. She shut her bag but once again and began to complain. "Obviously, that feeble fae, that wonky wizard, have failed. One could hardly expect anything else. And frankly, my patience is exhausted. Everyone's patience is exhausted. I insist that I am sent with my helpers to bring back the prince." "What makes you so sure that you can find him?" asked the king. The harpy twiddled her pearls. "I have my methods," she said, "and I promise he won't escape us." She lifted one leg, opened her talons, covered in their sick-making black nail varnish, and closed them again, and the queen buried her face in her hands. "As you see, my assistants are ready and waiting," and she waved her arm in the direction of the window, and sure enough there were 4 more loathsome harpies, like vultures with handbags, standing in the light of the lamp. "I'll take a few of the dogs as well, and you'll see, the boy will be back in no time." By dogs she meant the dreaded sky yelpers, with their fiery breath and their slavering jaws. The queen had turned white and fallen back in her chair. She thought of Gerke with her gentle, loving ways, of Odd showing them the baby mistmakers she meant to give the prince, and old Cor so proud to do his last service for the court. Why had they failed her? And how could she bear it if her son was snatched by bossy and evil-smelling women? Yet, how long could they still delay? The king now spoke. "We will wait for one more day," he said. "If the prince has not been returned by midnight tomorrow, I will send for you all and choose new rescuers to find him. Till then, everyone must return to their homes so that the queen can sleep." But the northerners have flown and slithered and hopped away. The king and queen did anything but sleep. All night long they stared at the darkness and thought with grief and longing and despair of their lost son. Chapter 12. Mrs. Trottle was in the bath. It was an enormous bath shaped like a seashell. All around the edge of the tub were little cut glass dishes to hold different kinds of soap, and gold-plated racks stretched across the water so that she could rest her box of chocolates on it, and her body lotions, and the sloppy love story she was reading. On the shelf above her head was a jar of pink bath crystals which smelled of roses, and a jar of green crystals which smelled of fern, and a jar of yellow crystals which smelled of lemon verbena. But the crystals she had put into the water were purple and smelled of violets. Mrs. Trottle's face was covered in a gunge of squashed strawberries, which was supposed to make her look young again. 3 heated bath towels waited on the rail. "Ta-ra-ra, boom-de-ray," sang Mrs. Trottle, lathering around her pink stomach. She felt very pleased with herself, for she had foiled the kidnappers who were after her darling Raymond. She had outwitted the gang. They would never find her babykins now. They would expect her to go to Scotland or to France, but she had been too clever for them. The hiding place she had found was as safe as houses and so comfortable. Mrs. Trottle chose another chocolate and added more hot water with her magenta-painted toe. Next door she could hear the rattle of dice as Raymond played Ludo with one of his bodyguards. She told Bruce that he had to let Raymond win, and he seemed to be doing what he was told. The poor fellow always cried when he lost at Ludo, and she was paying the guards enough. Reaching for the long-handled brush, she began to scrub her back. Landon was staying at home to find out what he could about the kidnappers. They would probably go on watching the house, and once she knew who they were, she would hire some thugs to get rid of them. That was the nice thing about being rich. There was nothing you couldn't do. And that reminded her of Ben. She rung the hospital. They thought they never told And though they never told you what you wanted to know, it didn't look as though Nanny Brown was ever coming out again. The second old woman was out of the way. She'd move against Ben. Thinking of Ramsden Hall in the Midlands made her smile. They took only difficult children that needed breaking in. There'd be no nonsense there about Ben going on too long with his schooling. The second he was old enough, he'd be sent to work in a factory or a mine. How she hated Ben. Why could he read years before Raymond? Why was he good at sport when her babykin found it so hard? And the way Ben had looked at her when he was little out of those big eyes, well, she'd found a place where they put a stop to all that. As for Raymond, she'd frightened him so thoroughly that there was no question of him wandering off again. He knew now that all the things he thought he'd seen in the park earlier in his bedroom were due to drugs he'd been given. "There's nothing people like that won't do if they get you in their clutches," she said to Raymond. "Cut off your ear, chain your foot." She hated alarming her pussykin, but Raymond would obey her now. What a splendid place this was, thought Mrs. Trottle. Dribbling soapy water over her thighs. Everything was provided, and yet perhaps the violet bath crystals weren't quite strong enough. Perhaps she should add something of her own, something she had brought from home. Sitting up, she reached for the bottle of man-eater on the bathroom stool. The man who mixed it for her had promised no one else had a scent like that. "You're the only lady in the world, Mrs. Trottle, who smells like this," he said. Upending the bottle, she poured the perfume generously into the water. Yes, that was it. Now she felt like her true, proper self. She leaned back and reached for her book. The hero was just raining kisses on the heroine's crimson lips. Mr. Trottle never rained kisses on her lips. He never rained anything. For another quarter of an hour, Mrs. Trottle lay happily soaking and reading, and then she pulled the plug. And we'll see what he finds out and see if Raymond or Ben can figure out what's going on. I'll see you guys later.